"You're not the supermodel I ordered," he said. Lily Carr stood in the doorway of Suite 1408 with a memory card in one hand and a camera strap cutting across her chest, and the specific expression of a person who has just understood that the universe has a sense of humor, and it is not particularly kind. The man in the doorway was tall in the way that rearranged available space. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of face that had been arranged by genetics into something worth looking at, and then hardened by whatever followed genetics into something that made looking at it a more complicated experience than simply aesthetic. He was looking at her the way she imagined customs agents looked at bags that did not match their declared contents, which was accurate, since she was not a supermodel by any definition she was aware of, and had not been ordered by anyone. She was wearing a grey hoodie, dark jeans, and boots that had walked 14 city blocks that afternoon and looked like it. She was holding a Fujifilm medium-format camera worth more than most people's monthly rent, and a memory card smaller than her thumbnail that belonged to the person in the room next door who had slid a note under Lily's door at 4 in the afternoon, asking if she had seen it. She had found it in the hallway outside the elevator. She had picked it up without thinking. She had come to return it, which was the kind of decision that seemed straightforward until it wasn't. "Wrong room," Lily said. She held the memory card out. "I'm returning this. It belongs to whoever is in 1407. Your neighbor." He did not take the card. He looked at it in her extended hand with an expression she could not read, which was already unusual enough that she noticed it, and she had been noticing things in frames and compositions for 11 years, which meant her noticing was reasonably calibrated. His face had changed when he saw the card, not dramatically, nothing as readable as surprise or recognition, but something had shifted underneath the surface of it, the way a current shifted beneath flat water. She became aware that her hand was still extended and that no one was taking what was in it. She withdrew her hand. "Sorry to bother you," she said, and turned to go. "How many photos did you look at?" he said. His voice was level in the specific way that things were level when effort had been applied to make them so. Lily turned back. "None," she said. "I picked it up off the floor. I shot the serial number with my phone to identify the owner, and the camera did an auto preview of the last image on the card for about 1 second before I switched it off. I did not look at anything deliberately." He studied her with the unhurried quality of a man who was running a calculation that required precision. "1 second, he said. She said, "1 second. I saw a hallway. I don't know whose hallway." I didn't recognize anyone. This was true and also incomplete, which was the nature of what she had seen. A corner of a corridor, 2 figures, something being exchanged between them, and then the screen had gone dark because she had switched it off because it was not her card and not her business. She had not thought about it again until this moment, when the way this man was looking at her suggested that perhaps she should have. The silence stretched to a length that had begun to mean something. Lily was good at silences. She spent a significant portion of her professional life waiting in them for the right light, the right angle, the moment when a subject forgot she was there. She recognized this silence as different. It was not a waiting silence. It was a deciding silence. Then he said, "Come in," and stepped back from the doorway. She did not move. He looked at her steadiness with something that was not quite respect and not quite surprise, and existed in the register between them. "I'm fine out here," she said. He said, "There are 2 men in the hallway who have been standing near the elevator for 11 minutes. They are not guests." Lily kept her face neutral. She looked, carefully, to her left. The hallway extended in both directions, lit with the even warmth of a good hotel's evening lighting. 30 feet to her left, near the alcove that contained the elevator bank, 2 men stood in conversation that was not quite convincing as conversation, the way people stood when they were maintaining a position rather than actually talking. One of them was looking at his phone, the other was looking at the corridor. Neither was looking at her. Yet, she looked back at Damien. She stepped inside. He closed the door. The suite was what money looked like when it had stopped needing to prove itself. Clean lines, no excess. The kind of quiet that came from good walls and better windows. The The city spread itself across the floor-to-ceiling glass on the far wall at the height of the 14th floor, which was not the highest floor, but was the floor that put the lights at exactly the right level to make. The city looked like it was performing for the room, rather than simply existing beyond it. Lily noticed this the way she noticed everything, with the part of her brain that was always composing, always looking for the frame inside the frame, even when the rest of her brain was occupied with the considerably more pressing matter of being inside a stranger's hotel suite at 8 in the evening because two men she did not know were standing near an elevator in a way that had convinced her this was the correct decision. She was not entirely certain it was the correct decision. She stayed near the door. He went to the desk on the far side of the room and picked up his phone and made a call. Short, 3 or 4 sentences in Italian she did not understand, and ended it. He set the phone down. He turned to look at her. "My name is Damien," he said, which was less information than she would have liked, and more than she had expected. Lily said, "Lily Carr," he said. "The card. You said you found it in the hallway." She said, "Outside the elevator. I picked it up. I looked at the serial number because I thought it might help me find the owner, and the camera did a 1-second preview because that's what the camera does when you insert a card it's already seen. I turned it off immediately." He was quiet. She said, "Who does it actually belong to?" He said, "Me." She looked at him. He had not been in the hallway. He had been in his room. The card had been in the hallway. She thought about that for a moment and did not say anything about it because she did not know enough yet to know what to say. She held the card out again. This time he took it. He turned it over once in his hand, a small rectangle of plastic that had apparently generated enough gravity to pull 2 men to an elevator bank and her into a stranger's hotel room, and he set it on the desk beside his phone. "How long do I need to stay?" she said. She meant it as a practical question, not a protest. He seemed to understand the distinction. He said, "The men outside are waiting for someone to leave this room with that card. Once I confirm the card is secure, they will be redirected." She said, "How long does that take?" He said, "Not long." She said, "And if I had just walked back to my room with it?" He looked at her steadily. "The man nearest the elevator has a photograph from the elevator camera taken this afternoon. He knows what you look like. He does not know you brought the card here." He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man choosing the least alarming version of accurate information. If you had walked back to your room, he would have known within 2 minutes which room you were in. Lily absorbed this with the outward calm she had developed over years of working in environments where showing that something had landed was a disadvantage. Inside the outward calm, several things were landing at once. She sat down in the chair nearest the door, which was not the most comfortable chair in the room but was the one closest to the exit, because some habits were structural. "You could have just said that at the door," she said. Damien looked at her with the closest thing to a wry expression she had yet seen on him. "You would not have come in," he said. She thought about this. He was correct. She would not have come in. She would have gone back to her room and locked the door and been moderately less safe than she currently was, which was not a condition she would have been able to evaluate from outside the information she now had. "All right," she said, because it was accurate, and because there was a version of the next several hours in which she sat in this chair and waited and then went back to her room and slept, and this became a story she told at dinner parties for years, and she preferred that version to the alternatives she could currently imagine. She looked at the city through the floor-to-ceiling glass and thought about the 1 second of preview on her camera screen. A hallway corner, 2 figures, something passing between hands. She thought about the way his face had changed when he saw the card. She thought about the 2 men near the elevator and the photograph from the elevator camera and the word redirected. She was a person who looked at images for a living. She was good at understanding what a frame contained and what it did not. She was beginning to understand that the frame of the last 8 minutes contained considerably more than she had initially composed it to hold. At 11 in the evening, the suite had settled into a particular kind of quiet that was different from silence, the quiet of two people who had stopped performing neutrality and had arrived at something more like a temporary truce. Damien had ordered food without asking what she wanted, which under different circumstances would have annoyed her, but he had ordered correctly, which meant he had looked at her and made an accurate inference, and Lily found accurate inferences harder to object to than well-intentioned guesses. She ate because she was hungry and because hunger was a problem she could solve, which was more than she could say for the other problems currently arranged in front of her. He ate standing at the desk, which told her that sitting down to a meal was not a thing he did when he was working, and he had been working continuously since she arrived. Phone calls she could not hear through the closed door of the second room. Messages she could see arriving on his watch. The particular quality of attention he brought to whatever was on the desk screen that suggested the room she was sitting in was only one of several rooms he was currently occupying in his mind. She did not interrupt. She was good at not interrupting. She had spent 11 years making herself invisible in rooms where things were happening, which was either the best professional training in the world or a significant personal pathology she had not yet fully addressed. "Tell me what you actually saw," he said. He had come back to the main room and was standing near the window, the city still performing behind him, and he was looking at her with the directness she had already catalogued as characteristic, the absence of the small social decorations most people placed around direct questions. Lily set her fork down. She considered what she had seen and what she was willing to describe, and whether there was a meaningful difference between those two things in this particular room. "A corridor," she said. "Hotel corridor. This property. I recognized the carpet pattern. Two men, one taller, dark jacket, profile visible, one shorter, face not in frame, something being exchanged. I could not identify the object. Ambient light from the corridor fixtures, no flash, so the image quality was limited by the available light and the fact that the camera was on my wrist when it triggered the preview, not at eye level." She paused. "Timestamp would be visible in the metadata if I checked." He looked at her for a moment. "You described that like a police report," he said. She said, "I described it like a photographer. It's the same grammar." He considered this with the expression of someone revising a file in real time. She picked up her fork again. He said, "The taller man in the dark jacket. What was the profile? Could you identify him from that image if you saw him again?" Lily set the fork down again. "Possibly," she said, and the word sat between them with the weight of the thing it was, which was an honest answer that did not make either of them more comfortable. He pulled a chair from the desk and sat down across from her, not at the table but angled toward it, closer than the professional distance they had been maintaining since she arrived. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at her in the way she had come to understand was his version of deciding to be direct. "The card was not in that hallway by accident," he said. "Someone removed it from this room and was moving it to a different location. The two men near the elevator were there to receive it. The person carrying it was intercepted before reaching them, which is why the card ended up on the floor." He stopped. She waited. He said, "The image on that card is evidence of something I need to present in a specific context to specific people. If it is seen by the wrong people first, it becomes something else." She looked at him steadily. "Evidence of what?" she said. He held her gaze. "Evidence that someone in my organization has been conducting business without my authorization, business that I would be held responsible for if it appeared that I knew." She absorbed this. She thought about the word organization and the way he used it with the specific tone of a man describing a structure that was larger than a corporation and governed by different rules. And she thought about the two men near the elevator and the intercepted courier and the way he had made a phone call in Italian at 8 in the evening without using a name, and she made an inference that she did not say aloud because she was good at not saying things aloud until she understood what saying them would cost her. She picked up her camera from the chair beside her and turned it in her hands, not to do anything with it, just the way she held it when she was thinking, the familiar weight of it reorganizing her attention. Damien watched her do this without comment. After a moment he said, "What is the camera?" She said, "Fujifilm GFX, medium format." He said, Medium format for editorial. She looked at him. Most people did not know what medium format meant in a practical context. He said, without elaborating, "My sister did fashion work for 3 years. I know what different cameras are used for," Lily said. "Editorial, some portrait work, anything where I need the detail to hold at large scale. I was here for a corporate shoot this afternoon. Rooftop, financial client, very boring, good light," he said. "The card you found. Do you use that format?" She said. "Different brand, but yes, same form factor." He nodded once, the nod of a man filing information into its correct location. They sat in the odd quiet of two people who had just had a conversation that was not the conversation either of them had expected to have, and outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city continued in its enormous, indifferent way, and Lily thought, not for the first time that evening, that she had composed better frames from worse situations. She looked at the card on the desk. He followed her gaze. She said, "The timestamp in the metadata will tell you exactly when the image was captured. The light conditions will tell you the approximate position of the camera relative to the subjects. If the card was removed from this room and carried through that specific corridor, the metadata will place it there." She paused. "That's not nothing, as evidence." He looked at the card, and then at her. "You can read that information from the image," he said. It was not a question. She said, "That is what I do. Not just what is in a frame. What the frame itself tells you about the conditions that produced it." He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had registered fully. Then he said, "The shoot this afternoon. You were on the roof of this building." She said, 42nd floor terrace." "Yes," he said. "What time?" She said, 2 until 5:30, roughly. He looked at her with a new quality of attention, sharp and reorganizing, and she understood that something she had said had changed the shape of the information he was working with. Though she did not yet know which part or how, the city outside had moved from evening into night proper, the lights settling into their overnight configuration, and Lily was aware of the hour and of the fact that the men near the elevator had presumably been redirected, because Damien's watch had stopped delivering the steady rhythm of messages that had characterized the first 2 hours of the evening, and the room had the quality of a situation that had stabilized without being resolved. She said, "How much longer?" He said, "You can go back to your room. The hallway is clear." She stood. She picked up her camera. She looked at the card on the desk, and at him, and said, "When this is over, the thing you said about being held responsible for something you didn't authorize, is that a real risk?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Then you need the metadata." He said, "Yes." She said, "I can extract it. The full read, not just the timestamp, position data, compression artifacts, the works. It would take me about 40 minutes with the right software, and I have the right software." He looked at her for a moment that held several calculations she could see moving behind his eyes. Then he said, "Why would you do that?" She said, "Because you told me the truth about the hallway when you didn't have to, and because I already looked at that image, which means I'm already in this frame whether I chose to be or not." He was still, outside, 300 meters away across the city, in a hotel suite on a different floor of a different property. Marcus Voss picked up his phone and listened to a man tell him that the card had not been recovered and that the photographer from the elevator was still an unknown variable. Marcus said, "Find out which room she's in," and ended the call and looked at the city, which was the same city and the same night, but was a different problem than the one he had started the evening with. She was back in the suite at 7 in the morning with her laptop and a coffee she had made in her own room because she had not wanted to arrive empty-handed, which she recognized as a social reflex that was slightly absurd given the circumstances, and did it anyway. Damien opened the door before she knocked, which meant he had heard her in the hallway, which meant he had been awake and close to the door, which told her the night had not been restful for either of them. He looked at the coffee she was carrying and said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was his version of thank you. She sat up at the desk he cleared for her without being asked, plugged in her extraction cable, and inserted the card. The software opened. She began to work. He stood at the window with his own coffee and watched the city come into its morning version of itself. And the room had the specific quality of two people occupying the same space without requiring anything from each other, which was rarer than it should have been, and Lily noticed it the way she noticed things that were compositionally unusual. The metadata came up in layers. She read it the way she read every image file, starting with the technical shell before moving inward to the content, which was a professional habit that had saved her more than once from reacting to something before she understood the full context of how it had been produced. Timestamp, 3:47 in the afternoon. Location embedded in the EXIF, hallway corridor. This hotel, 14th floor, 17 meters from the elevator bank, which placed the camera and the subjects at a precise point between the elevator and suite 1408. She looked at this information for a moment and then said, "The image was taken at 3:47 yesterday afternoon." Damien turned from the window. She said, "The position data puts the subjects 17 meters from the elevator on this floor, which means this corridor, this section." She pulled up the image itself, full resolution, and they both looked at it. The quality was limited by the wrist angle and the ambient light, as she had described the night before, but at full resolution on her screen, the taller figure had a profile that was not as ambiguous as the thumbnail had suggested. Dark jacket, a particular cut, the line of a jaw, the partial text of a room number on the door directly behind the shorter figure, 14, and then the rest cut off by the frame edge. 14, she said. That door is in this corridor. And the timestamp places this image in a window when the corporate event in conference room B on this floor was already underway. She looked at Damien. "You had a business meeting here yesterday afternoon." It was not a question. He came to the desk and looked at the screen beside her, closer than he had stood before, close enough that she could see the set of his jaw change as he looked at the profile of the taller figure. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, "The taller man is named Garrett Cole. He runs logistics for a subsidiary I have been in the process of closing." He straightened. "The meeting in conference room B was mine. I was in that room from 2:30 until 6, which means Garrett Cole was in this corridor at 3:47 while I was 40 meters away in a close session, and the room number behind him is 1403, which is a room booked under a name that is not in my organization's registry." She absorbed this in sequence. The logistics man, the side meeting, the unregistered room, the transaction captured at wrist angle in a 1-second preview by a camera that had not been pointed at anything on purpose. She said, "Whoever was carrying this card out of your room last night, they were taking the one piece of evidence that places a meeting you did not authorize in a room you cannot account for, at a time when you were provably elsewhere." He said, "Yes," she said, "and if the card had made it to the men at the elevator, the meeting stays invisible." He said, "And I remain responsible for whatever Garrett Cole arranged in that room, because the subsidiary is legally mine." She pulled up the compression data and ran a second read, which took 4 minutes, and returned a result that made her sit back in the chair and look at the ceiling for a moment before she said anything. He waited. She said, "There's a second image. Partial. Corrupted. Looks like the card was interrupted mid-write. The corruption pattern is consistent with someone pulling the card out of a device before the write cycle completed, which means someone was actively recording in that room and stopped abruptly." She looked at him. "If the uncorrupted portion of that second image is recoverable, it may show the room interior, the people in it, the object being exchanged." He said, "Can you recover it?" She said, "I can try. It will take longer." He said, "How long?" She said, 2 hours if I'm lucky. More if the corruption is deep." He looked at the screen, at the partial data, at the corrupted sector map she had pulled up beside the image file. He said, "Do it." She nodded and began to work, and the room settled into the particular silence of concentrated effort. And outside the window, the morning city moved through its ordinary business, and somewhere in that city Marcus Voss was receiving a message that told him the photographer had not returned to her room the previous night, which meant she was still with Damien, which meant the problem had grown overnight into something that required a different kind of solution. She had been working for 40 minutes when Damien said, from the window, "You have been doing this for 11 years. It was not a question, and it was not conversational filler. It was the kind of statement that was actually a question about something adjacent, and she had learned to recognize those. She said, "Since I was 22, I assisted for 2 years, went independent at 24. He said, "What made you go independent?" She kept her eyes on the screen. "Someone took work I produced and published it without crediting me. I could not afford to pursue it legally, and the agency I was contracted to at the time declined to intervene." She paused, watching a data sector reconstruct itself one column at a time. "I decided that the only way to own what I produced was to own the entire production chain. No agency, no long-term contracts, no shared rights." He was quiet for a moment. She said, "What?" He said, "Nothing. I made a similar decision at a different scale for a different reason." She looked up from the screen briefly, at his back against the window, the city behind him in the morning light, and thought that this was probably the truest thing either of them had said to each other. Not the information about the card or the metadata or the logistics man in the corridor, but this, the structure each of them had built from a wound they had not fully named. She looked back at the screen, the reconstruction completed at 2 hours and 12 minutes, which she considered lucky. The second image resolved in stages, the way images always resolved when you pulled them back from corruption, the broad shapes first and then the detail filling in column by column until what had been a grey grid became a room. Conference room B. She recognized the fixtures. A table, 3 men seated, 1 standing, and on the table between them, visible in the upper quadrant of the recovered image where the light was strongest, a document with a letterhead she could not read at this resolution but which had a logo she could enhance. She enhanced it. She looked at what it was. She said, "Damien." He crossed the room and stood behind her and looked at the screen. She heard the quality of his breath change, which was the only sound in the room for a moment. The logo on the document was not a cartel symbol or a criminal organization's mark. It was the corporate seal of a holding company that she did not recognize, but that he clearly did, because he said, very quietly, "That is Marcus's company, the one he registered 18 months ago that I told him to dissolve." She said, "He did not dissolve it." He said, "No." She looked at the document on the screen, at the table, at the 3 men seated and the 1 standing, and said, "Is Marcus the one standing?" He said yes. The room was very quiet. She saved the reconstruction, duplicated it to her drive, and to a cloud backup she ran automatically from the software, because 11 years of professional habit had made redundancy as reflexive as breathing, and then she looked up at him and said, "Now tell me what you need to do with this." He looked at the screen for one more moment, at Marcus standing at the head of a table in a room Damien had not known was being used, with a company Damien had told him to close, in an arrangement that had been conducted 17 meters from a meeting. Damien was running in good faith, and he said, "I need to move you out of this hotel." The house in the suburb had no distinguishing features from the outside, which was, she understood by now, the aesthetic of intentional invisibility. Cream brick, a front lawn that was maintained without being notable, a 2-car garage with both doors closed. The neighborhood was the kind that had a name on a real estate listing and no personality beyond it, which meant the neighbors looked without seeing, and the street cameras covered the intersection rather than the houses, and both of those things were clearly known by whoever had selected this location for its specific purpose. Lily had stopped asking where they were going somewhere on the second highway exit and had started watching how he drove instead, which told her more than a destination would have. Both hands on the wheel, eyes checking mirrors at intervals she could time with a watch. The specific economy of a man who had done this before, and was not doing it with urgency because urgency was a variable he had removed from the equation, by leaving the hotel 3 hours earlier than the situation appeared to require. She found this quality as readable as a well-exposed photograph. Everything in the frame intentional, nothing wasted. They had been in the house for 6 hours when she said, "You have been building this for longer than the card." He looked up from the documents spread across the dining table between them. He had been walking her through the structure of the subsidiary, the shell layers, the way Marcus had positioned the holding company as a pass-through that would absorb liability without appearing on any of Damien's personal filings. She had been annotating the recovered images against the document structure, matching the letterhead logo to the registration date, cross-referencing the timestamp of the corridor image against the entry log of conference room B that Damien had pulled from the action hotel's system through a contact she did not ask about. The work had a rhythm to it that surprised her, the two of them moving through the information from different directions and arriving at the same points without collision, which was not the dynamic she would have predicted from the first 20 minutes of their acquaintance. He said, "The subsidiary has been a problem for 14 months. Marcus has been a problem for longer than that, but I did not have a shape for it until recently." She said, "The card gave you the shape." He said, "The card gave me the location of the shape. Your extraction gave me the dimensions." She looked at the recovered image on her screen, Marcus standing at the head of the table with the holding company's document in front of men who were not in any of Damien's registries, and thought about the difference between a problem and a frame, which was that a problem could exist without being seen, and a frame made the invisible legible. She told him about the biased magazine editor in the way she had not told him the night before, the full version rather than the operational summary she had given when he had asked why she went independent, the editor's name, the specific photographs, the way the credit line had been removed before publication and replaced with the magazine's house credit, the conversation she had in his office afterward, where he had told her she was a talented assistant and should consider whether an independent career was the right path for someone at her stage. She told him she had kept every original file, every metadata record, every exchange of emails that demonstrated the chain of custody, and that she had never used any of it because using it would have required a legal process she could not fund, but that she had kept it because keeping it felt like the only form of ownership left to her. He listened to this the way he listened to everything, with the full attention that did not perform itself, and when she finished he said, "You still have it?" She said, "Every file." He said, 11 years. She said, "The metadata does not expire." He looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite an expression she could name, something that had the quality of recognition without the shape of surprise, as if she had said something he had been thinking in a different language. He said, "No, it does not." They were eating sandwiches she had assembled from the contents of the kitchen, which was stocked with the same functional minimalism as the rest of the house, when the front door opened. The sound preceded the recognition of what the sound meant by exactly the distance between a reflex and a thought, which was long enough for Damien to be on his feet before Lily had fully registered that the door had opened with a key rather than a knock. Marcus Voss was not what she had constructed from the recovered image. In the image, he had been a figure at a distance, identifiable by context and position. In the front hallway of the safe house, he was a man of about 50, heavy-set in the way of someone who had been athletic and had not bothered to maintain it, wearing a coat that had been expensive when it was bought and was now simply old, and carrying the specific quality of comfort in this space that told her he had been here before, many times, and considered it as available to him as any room in any property he controlled. He took in the scene, Damien standing, Lily at the table, the documents, her laptop, the annotated images on the screen. He looked at Lily with the focused attention of a man who had been briefed on a variable and was now meeting it in person. "You should not have brought her here," Marcus said. He was speaking to Damien but still looking at Lily, the look of a man assessing whether a problem was manageable or terminal. Damien said, "You should not have used the conference room." Marcus moved into the room the way he moved through the hallway, with the ease of ownership, and two men followed him in and positioned themselves near the wall in the manner of men who had positioned themselves near walls many times and knew the correct distance for the purpose. Lily looked at the two men, and then at Marcus, and then at Damien, and made herself be very still in the chair. Not from fear, though fear was present, but from the professional calculation that stillness was information, and she was not ready to give any away. Marcus said, "The card." Damien said, "Is secure." Marcus said, "I need it." Damien said, "I know what you need. I also know what is on it." The room shifted in temperature without changing in any physical way, the invisible adjustment of a space in which two people have arrived at the moment they have both been heading toward and have different expectations about what happens next. Marcus explained himself then, in the tone of a man presenting a reasonable business position, which Lily had come to recognize in the last 20 hours as a tone that the men in Damien's world used when they had made a decision they were not asking permission for. The legitimate pivot was too slow. The subsidiary generated income that nothing in Damien's approved portfolio could replicate in a reasonable window. The arrangement with the holding company was structured to remain invisible, which it would have, except for a photographer with a wrist-mounted camera and a 1-second auto preview. He was not apologizing. He was explaining, which was different, and the distinction was visible in the way he held his hands, open on the table between them, the gesture of a man offering terms rather than accepting blame. Then he said, "If the images are presented in the wrong context, they will be read as authorization. A meeting in a conference room booked adjacent to your session, documents with a corporate seal, his logistics director in the corridor. It reads as yours, Damien. I am telling you this not as a threat. I am telling you this as the reality of how the relevant parties will interpret the evidence." Lily heard this and understood it for what it was, which was not an argument but a recording in progress. She looked at Marcus's hands on the table and at the two men near the wall and at the coat that had been expensive once, and she understood that Marcus had not come here to take the card. He had come here to get Damien to say something. The card was already a problem Marcus had calculated into his position. What he needed now was a statement. She said, "He is not here to negotiate the card." Marcus looked at her with the full attention he had been withholding since he walked in. She kept her voice level and direct. If he wanted the card, he would have sent the two men rather than come himself. He is here because he needs you to agree to something in front of a witness. She looked at Marcus. "There is a recording running somewhere in this room. Your coat pocket, or one of the men by the wall. You want Damien to say the conference room meeting was authorized. Then the recording becomes the evidence that supersedes the card." The room was very quiet. Marcus looked at her for a long moment. The look of a man who has encountered an unexpected variable and is determining its weight. Damien looked at Lily, and she looked back at him, and she saw in his face the moment the same understanding arrived and confirmed itself. She reached across the table and picked up her camera, which she had set beside the documents when they sat down, and placed it on the table in front of her and pressed the record function without making a production of it. She said, "Now there are 2 recordings in this room. Let us see which one tells the better story." Marcus looked at the camera. He looked at the 2 men by the wall. He looked at Damien, who said nothing, because nothing was the correct thing to say when the opponent had lost the board and had not yet accepted it. Marcus pushed back from the table and stood, and his coat settled around him with the weight of a man who was recalculating his next position, and he said, "This is not finished." Damien said, "No, but this part of it is." Marcus looked at Lily one last time, the look of someone making a record of a face, and then he walked to the door and the 2 men followed him, and the door closed and the room was quiet. Damien stood still for a moment. Then he sat down. He looked at the camera on the table. He said, "You recorded him." She said, "Yes." He said, "You did not have to do that." She looked at him across the table with its documents and its annotated images and its 2 cups of cold coffee, and said, "You told me the truth in the hallway when you did not have to." This seemed like the appropriate response. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Thank you," without decoration, the 2 words carrying precisely the weight they needed to carry and no more, which was, she was coming to understand, the way he said everything. 48 hours after the suburban house, Lily was in a different hotel room in a different part of the city, a room she had chosen herself from a listing on her phone in the car on the way back, which was the first purely independent decision she had made in 2 days, and which felt, disproportionately, like something. The room was not on the 14th floor. It had a window that looked onto a brick wall and a fire escape, and a narrow strip of sky that changed color in the late afternoon, in a way she found more interesting than the panoramic city view she had left behind, which was a preference she recognized as specific to herself and had long ago stopped explaining to anyone. She sat on the bed with her laptop open and her camera beside her and went through every image she had taken in the last 48 hours. Not the metadata extractions, not the recovered second image from conference room B, which she had already duplicated and secured through 3 separate channels at Damien's request and her own professional instinct. The other photographs, the ones she had not meant to take. There were 11 of them. She had not been aware of taking any of them at the time, which was a thing that happened to her occasionally in high-stress environments, the camera becoming an extension of a seeing that operated below conscious decision, the hand moving because the eye had already composed and the thought had not caught up. She scrolled through them in sequence. The corridor outside the suite at the moment they left, the angle catching the geometric shadow of the elevator alcove in a way that made the empty space look like a decision rather than an absence. The stairwell they had taken down to the parking structure, 1 frame, the overhead emergency light, making the concrete look like something from a different era entirely. The highway at speed through the passenger window, the city dissolving into suburb in a single long exposure that she must have held for 3 seconds without knowing it, the lights becoming lines, becoming a kind of erasure. The kitchen of the suburban house at 6 in the morning with the pale winter light coming through the window above the sink and 1 coffee cup on the counter and no people in the frame at all. And then, at the end of the sequence, 4 photographs of Damien. She did not remember taking any of them. She looked at them for a long time. In the first, he was at the dining table, bent over documents, not looking at the camera, unaware. The light was the flat midday light of a room with no particular orientation, and yet the image had a quality she could not have produced deliberately, the quality of a subject who had forgotten to perform, which was the thing she spent most of her professional life waiting for and almost never achieved with someone who knew she was in the room. In the second, he was standing at the kitchen counter with a glass of water, looking at the window, and the light was behind him and his face was in shadow and the image should not have worked technically and did work in every other sense. In the third, he was looking at her laptop screen, the recovered image open, and his expression was the expression she had seen when he said Marcus's company, the controlled surface with the thing underneath it that had shifted without breaking, and she had caught it at the exact second of the shift. In the fourth, he was looking directly at the camera. She did not know when she had taken it. She did not know when he had looked at her. The expression on his face in that frame was one she could not categorize, which was unusual because she had spent 11 years categorizing the expressions on the faces of people in rooms, and the absence of a category for this particular expression told her something she was not certain she was ready to know. She closed the laptop. She looked at the brick wall outside the window and the fire escape and the strip of sky, which had gone from blue to the particular amber of early evening in this city in October, which she was beginning to associate with the last few days in a way she would probably not be able to separate from it going forward. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. "Damien," she answered. He said, "The evidence has been presented to the relevant parties. Marcus's arrangement with the holding company is being reviewed. Garrett Cole is cooperating," she said. "And Marcus," he said. "Marcus is a problem that will require more than 48 hours, but the immediate risk has been restructured." She absorbed the word restructured, which was doing a significant amount of work in that sentence. He said, "You are no longer a variable in anything Marcus is managing. As of this morning, your name does not appear in any documentation related to the card or the images. The camera recording from the suburban house has been presented as Damien's own security footage from a personal device." She understood what this meant. She had been removed from the frame, not erased, not harmed, but carefully extracted from the visible picture in a way that left her precisely where she had been before a memory card had fallen out of someone's pocket in a hotel corridor. She said, "You did that?" He said, "Yes," she said, without asking me. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I could put you back in if you prefer." She almost laughed. It came out as something smaller and less definable. She said, "No, I do not prefer." He said, "Good." She said, "Damien." He said, "Yes." She said, "The fourth photograph." He said, "I know." She said, "You knew I was taking it." He said, "Yes." She said, "You let me." He said, "Yes." The line was quiet for a moment, not the empty quiet of a bad connection, but the full quiet of two people on either end of something they were both deciding at the same time. He said, "I would like to see it." She said, "Come see it then." He was at the door of her room 40 minutes later, which was long enough that he had not been around the corner waiting and short enough that he had not been far. She let him in. The room was small in a way the suite had not been, and his presence in it reorganized the available space in the same way it had reorganized the suite doorway on the first evening, which felt like longer ago than 48 hours and also like a continuous present she had not left. She opened the laptop on the small desk by the window and turned it so he could see the screen, the fourth photograph. His face looking directly into the camera with the expression she could not categorize. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. She stood beside him and looked at it too, because she had found that looking at a photograph alongside the person in it told her things she could not see alone. The way the subject's presence in the same room as the image revealed what the image had captured without their knowledge. He said, "I did not know I looked like that." She said, "No one knows. That is the point." He turned to look at her, which meant he was very close, the small room having conducted them into proximity that the suite had managed to avoid through its greater volume. He said, "What does it look like?" She said, "Like someone who has stopped deciding whether to look." The amber light from the strip of sky through the window was on its way out, the room darkening in the quiet way of early evening, and she thought about a camera on a wrist and a 1-second preview and the specific way that things were visible before you decided to see them. He said, "Keep it." She said, "I was going to." He looked at her for a moment with that same expression the photograph had caught, the one without a category, and she looked back at him and did not look away, which was the decision she made. The frame she stepped into rather than composed from the outside, and it was not like anything she had a professional language for, because it was not professional at all. 3 weeks later, there was a small exhibition in a gallery in the downtown arts district. 6 photographers, 12 images each, a Thursday evening opening with wine that was better than average and lighting that was worse. Lily had submitted her 12 images before any of the last 4 days had happened, but she had made one substitution at the last moment, pulling a corporate rooftop shot that had been technically strong and emotionally inert, and replacing it with the corridor image from the suite exit, the one with the geometric shadow of the elevator alcove, making the empty space look like a decision rather than an absence. It was the first image in her sequence on the gallery wall, and it was the one people stopped at longest, asking her what they were looking at, and she said, "A hotel corridor," and they said, "But what is it about?" And she said, "About the moment between staying and leaving," which was accurate, and was also everything she was willing to say about it in a room full of people holding wine. She was talking to the gallery director when she became aware of someone standing in front of the last image in her sequence, the one she had not listed in the exhibition notes and had hung without a title. She excused herself and crossed the room. Damien was standing in front of the 4th photograph, his own face looking back at him from a 100-centimeter print, the amber-tinted grain of a low-light room, and an expression that had no category. He did not look away from the image when she stopped beside him. He said, "You hung it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Without telling me." She said, "I told you to come see it." He turned to look at her then, and the gallery light was not good. as she had noted, and the wine was better than average, and neither of those things was relevant to anything. He said, "I came." She said, "You did." He looked at her in the way the photograph had caught him looking, without deciding whether to look, and she thought, "This is the frame. This is the one you do not compose from the outside, but find yourself inside of, and the light is wrong, and the timing is imperfect, and the subject is looking directly at you, and you would not change any of it." She said, "There is a second print, if you want it." He said, "I want it." She said, "Good." And the gallery continued around them, and the city continued outside, and the amber October held its last few evenings before the season turned, and neither of them moved, and neither of them needed to.